this result, if it is true, is that women in science may do better with male mentors, which is that, and this, it's related to what you were just talking about, but it's not exactly the same, which is that in other primate species, and indeed in pre-industrial human societies, male and female social interactions were, of course, mixed, but they were very distinct. And in all other primate species, this is 100% true, male hierarchies, male dominance hierarchies, and female dominance hierarchies. There's all this stuff in the common discourse about alpha males and beta males and all of this, and very little discussion about actually there's a parallel, but very much not the same dominance hierarchy among females in baboons, in squirrel monkeys, in all of these species. And in other species, you also have sort of rules around what are called philopatry and dispersal. Again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Philopatry and dispersal, where, sex-based rules, where which sex at the point that it becomes a reproductive age disperses and goes find another group, and which sex stays in its natal clan. And whichever sex stays, whichever sex is so-called philopatric, tends to have the more kin-based, rule-rich model of dominance hierarchy, be it female or male, than the one who, and the sex who's going to be dispersing in that case. So anyway, all of this is true. We know that is true. And what we're trying to do in the late 20th and early 21st century is reconfigure some traditional rules around separate female and male lines of hierarchy in the workplace, for instance. And it's not easy. It's not simple. And frankly, one of the things that makes it not easy and not simple is that men find it pretty easy, and without thinking about it, just natural, which is a word that isn't great to use here, but to compete with one another. And so do women. And competition between men looks like the way we all think of competition between men typically looking, and competition between women doesn't look like fisticuffs. It looks more covert. It looks more about changing of social reputation, etc. But it may well be, and anecdotally, I think I have seen this, not just for myself, but across many of my peers, that it is easier effectively to walk into a situation across sex and not be seen as a competitor right away, and thus get a more collaborative dynamic going more easily. So it's effectively a way to kludge, to get around the older dominance hierarchies that are within sex. And will dominance hierarchies emerge that are together with both sexes? Of course they will, but they're newer, and we have a better chance of more easily changing the rules.
All right. So I agree with that, although, I want to know whether it's symmetrical, right? Male walking into a system of females may be disruptive of the collaborative instinct. Who knows?
Well, but I didn't say a system of male, like a woman walking into a system of males. And this isn't, so this study, which I didn't read all of, but I read a little bit of it, they're not looking at like PhD advisors and their graduate students. They specifically aren't. They're looking at publication records where there's a senior author and a junior author, and looking at the sex between them. And so that's not, sometimes these papers have 8, 10, 40 people on them, but, and I have no idea how carefully they looked. But in general, they were looking at dyadic relationships. They thought they were looking at dyadic relationships, which is to say one older person, and one senior person, one junior person. And their rubric for that was just something like, did you get your PhD more than 7 years ago or less than 7 years ago? So it's, it's a little bit,
it's coarse.
It's coarse. But it's not, it's not a man walking into a system, a whole group of women or women.
I was responding to what you were saying about a dynamic. I wasn't talking about the paper in that case, right? So, about the ability to generate collaboration was what I was responding to. So I do want to say, though, there's a possibility of something more, the reason that the philosophy of science part matters is that if the hypothesis pre-exists the test, right, then that it is not confirmation bias, right? So
that what isn't confirmation bias?
If the hypothesis follows from the test, in other words, what you really have is an empirical observation and then a hypothesis, and then these things are very frequently reported as if the hypothesis preceded the test, then the point is you haven't really tested it.
You have not tested it.
And so you don't have the the power that comes from the scientific method. In this case, though, if the test is accurate and it reflects the hypothesis that existed beforehand, even better that they didn't know about it in some sense, because they couldn't have been responding to it or were unlikely to be, then the question is, what does that say about it reflects well on the model that generated the hypothesis and the prediction?
Yep.
So what does that model say? One of the things that model says is that there is a male mode that is actually, I don't want to say integral, but is strongly consistent with scientific progress. And that male model, I'm going to argue, has to do with what we have described as taking the piss out of each other. That there is a way that men who view each other as collaborators will still, seek each other's weaknesses, poke at them, prod them. There is a sort of competitive mode that results in you becoming anti-fragile because your intimate partners are finding what's wrong with your work so that you can take care of it before you unveil it to the world, that kind of thing. Yeah. And that women have a system. I'm not saying that any of this has to be, but women have a system in which with those they are collaborating with, there tends to be a reflexive support.
A building up.
Right. A building people up. And so the point is that this might have an implication. Now, here's the thing. You had male mentors, mostly male mentors in graduate school.
Yes.
Okay. So Arnold Kluge, Dick Alexander, I had mostly male mentors also, but Elizabeth Calco stands out to me. The marvelous, she is now dead, unfortunately, but anyway, the most extraordinary Batwoman of all, who herself had been mentored by Charles Handley. So anyway, here's the thing. If this paper is accurate and it correctly reveals that the hypothesis that was on the table, which is that there are male and female kinds of wisdom that have been transmitted and that they have to be transmitted across in order to bring everyone in on the endeavor, then this predicts some further things, right? Oh, I should point out, the second result here is kind of interesting too, which was that mentoring females appeared to have a cost to the mentors going forward also. So that actually, yes. I didn't catch that. So that actually is suggestive of a mechanism here, which is to say that the dynamic between mentor and mentee might be less effective. In other words, if you imagine just as a placeholder.
So are you sure about that result? You didn't get that from the abstract, did you?
No, I think I did.
So you have a reduction in the gain of female mentors for the mentees. Yeah, that's not that to me does not read as a cost to mentors.
Well, we will have to go back and find. I think that's what it does mean. But anyway. Where were we?
Sorry to distract you.
No, that's okay. In any case, one way or the other, what this predicts going forward, if the model is accurate, and this is a proper test of it, which is robust, then it predicts actually that the effect will decay over time. That is to say that females who have been mentored by males and gotten the benefit of it will be better mentors to females that they mentor in the future, right? So
second order male mentorship.
Yeah, I mean, and I hate to put it that way because I don't think it's like the men deserve credit for it. But what I do think is that the answer, look, you and I.
Well, and if my hypothesis is correct, which I expect it to be, I'm not sure, but I expect it also to be weaker than what you're talking about. But if it is true, then it would also go in the opposite direction. And so you would have a potential benefit to men being mentored by women, but you could have second order female mentorship in which a man who had been mentored by a woman might be less competitive, say, with his male mentees than he would be if he had been mentored by a man himself.
Yeah, and certainly this being a complex system, you would expect many such effects to be overlayered with each other, and figuring out which ones, had what strength of effect would be, a whole line of inquiry that might arise here.
Yeah. So I'm reminded that you were going.
No, go ahead.
I'm reminded of the conversation I had with Tom on impact theory this week, which I don't think is out yet, but I was on his podcast this week, and we were talking a little bit about sex and gender and roles in the workplace. And he said, he's a very successful entrepreneur. He said, Tom, when I'm leading teams that are entirely male, it's much easier for me. But when I'm leading teams that are mixed sex, they're more productive. And this is something I kept coming back to throughout our conversation. I thought that is a beautiful observation, and I kind of hope it holds, right? It doesn't surprise me that it's easier if it's all one sex. And he used some of this kind of language that I don't think he said we take the piss out of each other. It's like I can tell my teammates, even when I'm the leader, that they're being fuck ups and they need to up their game, and it's expected. And if I don't do that, then they have no way to know. And the work on mixed sex teams is slower, and I have to be thinking about these people's feelings in a way I don't have to be thinking about these people's feelings, and it's a lot more chaotic. But he asserts, and this is not, he's not being politically correct, he asserts that they are ultimately more productive.
Now, so got two things I want to get to, and I don't want to forget either of them. Okay. One of them is that is suggestive of an analog of hybrid vigor. And this is another point that I think we've been hinting around and we've made a couple times, but I really want it to be explicit. So hybrid vigor is the recognition, and this comes from breeding. This is actually a genetic phenomenon in artificial selection of things like farm animals. That if you take two purebred critters and you breed them together, they often have extraordinary capacity relative to their parents, right? And there can be a number of reasons for this. One, purebreds may be hobbled by being purebreds. In other words, the inbreeding that comes along with getting a pure line can be destructive, and so this can be liberating of that. But it also can be that there are advantages to borrowing from two milieus. So to the extent that there is male and female wisdom, and you have a team in which people are native to both of these languages, that team potentially, if you can figure out how to get it not to trip over itself, has both modes available.
Yes.
And so, okay, so the last point I want to make here is an awful lot of what is going on in academia is based on the assertion that the characteristics of the person at the front of the room dictate whether or not the students in the chairs are going to be effectively able to learn from them. That unless you see somebody who looks like you at the front of the room, you've got a problem, right? Now, my point would be that is nonsense. That is not to say there's no component of truth in it. I think that there is going to be some positive effect of having somebody you very easily identify with at the front of the room, and some component of that will be based on superficial characteristics. But the idea that you should upend a faculty in order to get people at the front of the room who look like the students, which is, by the way, crazy because the students don't tend to look like each other. So how do you even do it without segregating, right?
Chimerism.
Right. But the idea that we should be refactoring the world so that, the most important thing is that the people at the front of the room have the same skin color or sexual orientation or whatever it is.
You're sacrificing academic rigor for a failure of imagination on the part of students.
Right. And you're also potentially sacrificing, even to the extent that the world looks the way it does because of unfairness, to the extent that some people have the insight into how the work gets done. If you want to make the world fair, whatever they know has to be democratized, right? And in some sense, that's going to make for very uncomfortable conclusions. Like, you might want to, have a male mentor if you're female because it is going to make you a stronger competitor going forward in a world where some large fraction of the people you're dealing with are male. I don't know that that's where it comes from, but that's at least a viable possibility. So anyway, but the final conclusion here is that the demand by those who are outraged by this is that the paper be retracted, right? And yes, there are some valid concerns that are raised about the methodology of the paper, as there always are. It is not hard to take almost any paper of any complexity and find things that weren't done well, that open the possibility of some other explanation. It's very hard to do perfect work, right? It almost never happens. But it appears that there is this motivation to find anything and everything wrong with this paper in order to justify the claim that it is so bad that not only does it need to be challenged, but it needs to be retracted because the damage that comes from it. And this is so much the ethos of the moment where, a paper that is wrong has to be held accountable for its error, whether or not that was the intent, because after all, harm is the end all and be all, and people are certainly going to be harmed by the idea that, that one might wonder about whether or not, wisdom is being properly transmitted based on the sex of the mentor.
Right.
So anyway, I just think this is emblematic of everything we're seeing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's conclusion driven, and the methodology is flawed, therefore you must retract line of activists is becoming the go-to line, right? It's exactly the one they used against Lisa Littman's work on rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is, I believe, the term that she actually introduced in the paper in question. And I believe in that case, I don't remember the specifics, that it was pulled and she did revise and it went back out and almost nothing changed. And so, the journal was able to basically say that they had caved to the activists, and the work is still out there because it was good work and it's important work. But anyway, the point there being, and like here, there's literally no information at all in a claim that there are methodological flaws in a paper. That's, yes, too bad, and that's part of what the peer review process is supposed to be about and to find, and papers that are deeply flawed should not be published, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in this era, the claim that there are methodological problems is simply another activist tactic and should be treated as such.
Yeah,
which is a shame, because legitimate methodological flaws that were not caught in peer review do warrant a very careful critique and thought about whether or not a paper should have been published. But that's not what's going on.
No, it's not. And I would just say, even if your bent is that this is all about structural unfairness in the system, one interpretation of the paper is that it has unearthed a serious kind of structural unfairness, right? To the extent that this result is robust, right? It now invites a conversation about what might be causing it. And it may be kinds of wisdom that need to be transmitted in various ways. It may be just purely the bias of people downstream who don't take you seriously if you had a female mentor. Who knows? But the point is, if it's a result, if the result is robust, then, it tells us there's a phenomenon that we need to be finding.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon that we need to be finding. The conversation needs to be allowed to be had. If you stop the conversation by retracting a paper, those conversations will continue to be had. They'll just be underground, out of view by the activists, and get stronger, frankly, I hope. But those two, let's see, you just said two possible mechanisms of explanation, one of which is what we've been talking about, and one of which is, well, maybe it's about the bias of people downstream who don't take you as seriously if you had a female mentor. I think that doesn't apply here because we're not actually talking about the standard definition of mentor. We're talking about people who've published with people as opposed to being their PhD advisors. But take that standard model of mentorship.
You can adjust. What I was saying was it's not sensitive to which kind of mentor. In other words, if people in your little field are aware of who you've published with, that could potentially be a factor.
Sure. Okay. I guess so. I think if I'm, it's really hard to steelman this position here. But if I'm going to try to steelman their position, I would say it's absolutely critical that, even if we are reasonable human beings, that we can grant that there are different kinds of wisdom that have tended to travel on the male and female lines, and we would like cross-pollination between them, and therefore there might be benefit to having men and women working together. Hey, look at that. It is deplorable and abhorrent, and we must stop immediately in its tracks the bias that is simply opposed to someone on the basis of some immutable demographic characteristic. Stopping this conversation because some people will use it to justify that bias, I think, is what is going on in their heads. And see, I did a terrible job of steelmanning that because I can't do it. But I do think that even though probably almost none of the activists know that that's what they're scared of, it's that this result will be used to justify a bias. And what they've imagined is the only explanation for this being beneficial is bias. And it's a little bit like, the 4-to-1 ratio of male to female software engineers at Google. It must be bias. That's the only possible explanation. No. There are many other possible explanations, and I believe strongly that most of them have far more explanatory power than bias. Is there still bias? Presumably, yes. Should we be trying to eradicate it? Obviously. Should we not talk about it in order to not give anyone any sense that there's bias? Or like, what was that? How did you even get there, right? So the activist response is actually counterproductive even to their honorable goals. And as to their dishonorable goals, I don't know why we're playing games with them at all.
Yeah. So the whole thing, I would say, there are lots of cruddy, there are lots of people who aren't very good up in the upper echelons of science, and certainly in the vast ranks of those doing science. That said, the work is subtle, and there is a great deal that is learned as somebody who figures out how to wield these tools properly comes to that knowledge.
Yeah.
And the activists are involved in a response to it as if there was nothing there. And their basic point is, look, we can spot the truth. We know what the truth is. And so if you come up with a paper that's offensive relative to this model that is the truth, then of course you should retract it. Why would we want anything but the truth in these scientific journals? And the answer is, you don't know what you're freaking talking about. You have no idea how complex things like sociality are, and therefore, how messy the truth is going to be. And the real question that they, don't seem willing to ask is, if we had the truth, which we don't yet, right? We won't ever fully get there. It's a diminishing returns problem. But if we had the truth, how bad is it? Now, my sense, having spent all of my adult life in this game, is the truth is messy, but it's actually way better than it could be, right? In fact, these problems are solvable, but we're never going to get there if we're, fighting over whether or not we are allowed to consider the mess.